Before I begin, I would like to first acknowledge that we're meeting on the lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation and pay my respects to their elders past, present, and emerging. And it's really my pleasure today to introduce Professor Evan Kidd at the ANU. Evan's actually a friend of mine who I met about 10 years ago after a talk very similar to, well, probably different in content from this one, but I basically cornered him and asked him many, many annoying questions, and that led to a friendship, as happens in academia, and really quite a lovely collaboration as well. Evan is a very, very interesting thinker about all sorts of aspects of language. He studies adult language learning, language acquisition, individual differences in language use, as well as a lot of very interesting work on cross-linguistic language things, typology, which I know is of interest to many people here, sentence planning and production. Basically, the list goes on and on. He was one of the key people involved in the Center of Excellence for the Dynamics of Language. And I think that his bevy of interests both reflects that and also is part of why he's been so influential on much of the entire Australian study of language. So here you go, Evan.
Thanks, Andy. Thanks. First, let me start by also acknowledging that we meet on the unceded lands of the Wurundjeri people. And I pay my respects to the elders past, present, and emerging. This is also something of a homecoming for me. So I was talking to my mum last night. I'm from Melbourne, and it turns out that I was born on this site. So my mum, it used to be a hospital for those who didn't know. So yes, as my mum said quite eloquently, it must be weird to give a talk in the place you took your first breath. So I hope that I can, make that baby Evan proud. So today I'm going to talk about some work that I've been doing on with some great colleagues of mine, junior colleagues and students, Rowena Garcia, Jens Rosa, Inian Vargas, and Safina Fathin, on cross-linguistic structural priming. So cross-linguistic structural priming is when you speak more than one language, you hear a structure in one language, and then you use that same structure in the other language that you speak, or a similar structure in the other language you speak, depending on the difference between the languages, which is kind of an interesting and somewhat surprising phenomenon. It's all right, no more technical difficulties. So I'll give a brief overview of what I'm going to talk about. I'll talk about syntactic priming, then cross-linguistic syntactic priming, and then I'll present 3 experiments that uses typological variation to determine the locus of priming. Structural priming itself is a tendency for speakers to produce a structure they've previously encountered. So for instance, in a classic experiment, a participant might see a picture like this. They might hear a prime, such as an English passive. The frog was kicked by the bear. Hold on to that. If you don't know much about language, we're going to be talking lots about passives today. And then after they hear or read the prime, they'll get an unrelated picture, and they're just simply asked to produce a description of that picture. And then more often than not, well, not more often than not, but more often than is statistically random, they'll produce a passive structure as well. So they might say something like, the dog was tickled by the monkey. So priming is a very robust and pervasive phenomenon. It occurs not only in language, but in other parts of cognition, but also occurs in words as well, in the lexicon, I should say. But for structural priming, the fact that it occurs, and it occurs in the case that I just showed to you, in the absence of what we call open class word overlap, so nouns and verbs, which carry meaning in sentences, it suggests that the effect is structural in nature. It's occurring at an abstract level that suggests that when you're primed, you're accessing some common abstract structural representation that leads you to produce a subsequent passive to describe an unrelated scene. As I said, the effect itself is very robust and occurs across many different contexts and many different populations. So it occurs in production, like I described, but also comprehension. It occurs in very young children. In fact, we think that it might be indicative of what is known as implicit-based error learning mechanism that might drive syntactic acquisition. I'll come back to that in a moment. It occurs in individuals with acquired language disorders such as aphasia and amnesia, and it occurs within and across languages, which is what I'm interested in today. So in what feels like it was just a few years ago, but it was over 20 years ago now, that happens when you get old, Rob Hartzacker and colleagues observed the effect, this cross-linguistic priming effect in Spanish-English bilinguals. So they gave Spanish-English bilinguals a prime in Spanish, such as la rana fue pateada por el oso, or the frog was kicked by the bear. And then they gave them a picture and it simply asked them to switch languages. Describe this next picture in English. And lo and behold, they produced passives after they heard in English, after they heard a passive in English. Now, this is pretty, I guess, surprising, but a great effect to observe at the time, because the canon for a long time, at least in some parts of bilingual studies, is that bilinguals had two languages in one. They had two systems that didn't necessarily have to interact. They had two systems where the grammars would be, described and represented in separate ways. But it seems like if there's evidence of cross-linguistic priming, then bilingual individuals have a degree of integration in the linguistic system, such that they're depending on common syntactic representations when they're speaking both of their languages. But the question that we have to ask is, what are we actually priming here? So there's many different things that we could be priming. So, and I apologize for those without a linguistics background, because there's going to be a bit of jargon in this talk, and I'm going to do my very best to be able to take you all through it. So we could be priming at what we call the thematic role level, or sort of a level of meaning. What we could be priming here is put a patient before an agent, right? Focus on a patient first, and then therefore that might lead people to produce a passive in English after hearing a passive in Spanish. We could be priming at the level of grammatical roles, or specifically mapping from the thematic role to a grammatical role. So what we do here is we're putting we're mapping the patient to the subject grammatical role here in both of these languages, and the priming could be due to this particular sort of often unexpected occurrence in both languages where passives are fairly infrequent. Finally, it could be due to not only these things, but to the constituent word order overlap. So in both of these languages, the passive starts out with a noun phrase, followed by a verb, followed by a prepositional phrase. So it might be that all of these things match up to lead to this priming effect. And we won't know at what level we're priming at in a language like English and Spanish, because actually these languages are related to each other. They have this European passive, which is formed in almost exactly the same way. These words are almost like word for word translations of each other. So priming could be conceivably occurring at one or more of these levels, and testing only typologically related languages isn't going to tell us this, because we can't tease apart these types of loci of priming here. It's another soapbox of mine about testing lots of typologically different languages, which is sort of implicit in this talk, but I won't talk about. Most of the research subsequent research focused on whether it was this sort of final level of structure, constituent word order overlap, and whether that was a precondition for priming. So Sarah Bernelet and Rob Hartzacker and other people working in Belgium have used aspects of the word order variability in Dutch to be able to test whether or not requiring this constituent word order overlap, having the same constituent word order, is a condition of priming. So what they did is they exploited a like nice feature of Dutch, and once again we're working with the passives, where you can switch the word order. So they had primes like de kerk wordt getroffen door de bliksem, which is basically the church is struck by the lightning. And then in Dutch you can put the verb at the end, right? So you can have two different types of passive, at least in this experiment. So they had de kerk wordt door bliksem getroffen, which is literally the church is by the lightning struck, which doesn't sound actually so terrible to an English speaker, but at the same time is if someone said it like that in casual conversation, you might question whether or not you wanted to be in that conversation, right? What they were testing here is whether or not this particular condition here is the only condition under which you would get priming. And what they found is that that was the condition in which you got the most priming, but still you got a priming effect in the condition where there wasn't constituent word order overlap. So there is some evidence to suggest it's not just happening in this full overlap condition. And other people have found this also. So in different language combinations, so in Polish and English, Chinese, Mandarin and English, and Korean and English, although the Korean English one seems to have not been replicated subsequently, which is not unusual because the effect itself of whether or not constituent word order is required for priming is inconsistent, I suppose. So there's many examples where constituent word order has blocked priming or not resulted in priming. So some work, mainly actually work done in German English bilinguals, but also Dutch English bilinguals with different structures have not found the priming effect when there's a lack of constituent word order overlap. And in older work that we did in my lab, we observed priming only when we used an ambiguity in German to see, which I'll come to at the end of the talk, to show that constituent word order matters, but the mapping also matters between constituent word order and the thematic roles. So I'm not telling you anything new here. Some people are finding the effect when the absence of constituent word order overlap, and some people aren't, but the absence of effect doesn't mean it doesn't exist. But I think a more interesting thing is that focusing on constituent word order only, it has obscured priming at the other levels of representation, at sort of purely thematic and meaning-based level, and also the mappings onto grammatical roles. And this in part is driven by the fact that people have been just really convenient sampling language combinations. So a lot of this work's coming out of Europe, and what's happening is people are saying, okay, everyone's often speaks English, and then we'll use a language that we have, say, spoken in Belgium or spoken in German, to be able to scrutinize the effect. But when you're testing related languages, you're getting sort of parts of overlap that you can't disentangle, right? And so in the experiments that I'm going to present today, we've actually chosen languages where we can, at each of those levels, test whether or not we are finding cross-linguistic priming. This is one of those effects in the literature as well, where the effect comes before the theory, which is not uncommon, right, in cognitive and psychological sciences. And so what I'm going to do now is quickly take you through a connectionist model, of explicit computational model, in very simple terms, because it's quite mind-bogglingly complex, this model, of sentence production that accounts for priming. And then in the last few years, some people have created a bilingual model of it that kind of at least clears up a few of these empirical inconsistencies. So this is Franklin Chang's sentence production model. So what the model has is two separate pathways in order. Basically, its job is to learn to produce sentences. And in the process of learning to produce sentences, it acquires syntactic knowledge. So it's not only a model of sentence production, it's a model of syntax acquisition. So it's quite elegant in the many things that it explains. And it has two different separate pathways. It has a meaning pathway in which the the model is given a kind of an event representation that it has to produce a sentence for. So just say it has to produce a sentence for the boy broke the bottle, then it's given the words, knows the words, say for boy and bottle, and it's given the roles that the boy and the bottle should take in the sentence, and they're marked here by X, Y, and Z. Don't worry about Z. There's no Z role in this one here, and it's given the verb itself, right? So it makes temporary associations between the concepts and their role in the sentence. So that in this particular instance, boy is going to be an agent, right? But boy could be a patient or a theme in other sentences that it's going to produce. So these are temporary associations in the meaning system. And then the two systems converge, this sequencing system. So the sequencing system is a simple recurrent network. What the model does, it has to order these roles in a word-by-word fashion in order to produce the sentence. And by learning to order the roles, it starts to learn deeper syntactic and grammatical facts about the language. So it starts to learn, okay, a sort of concept of grammatical subject, a concept of grammatical object, and things like that. So in this case here, boy is the agent, and so this will be weighted higher, and because it's weighted higher, it's going to be produced first. This is learning a version of English, right? So then the boy is the agent, and then after a while, after many sentences, the model is going to learn, okay, agents are often subjects, right? And they often come first in this language. And then therefore it starts to induce this sort of distributed notion of a subject. And then this is fed back through the network. And then it says, well, after grammatical subjects, often we have verbs in this language. So a verb comes, or action, then it starts to reduce a constructive verb, and so on and so forth. So we get the bottle afterwards like that. A key feature of this model is that it learns via implicit learning. So it's trained when it makes a mistake. There's backpropagation of error, and then its weights are updated in order to do better the next time, I suppose. And in this sense, this was also an explanation for priming. So when the system gets, or the model gets a prime sentence, if the prime is unexpected, generates an error signal. This updates the weights, and then subsequently when it's meant to produce another transitive sentence, if there's error signal from a passive prime, then the likelihood that it will produce a passive in a target trial is higher. And it explains a lot of the behavioral data very beautifully in this sense. So keep that in mind. Co and colleagues from Nijmegen, actually, where I was previously working, developed recently a bilingual version of this model. It's pretty nice in the sense that all they did really was give it a language layer, and they can train it on different languages. The bilingual model itself is also simulates a lot of real-world phenomena, which is kind of cool. So if you train the model on a first language and then subsequently train it on a second language, it creates grammatical errors that are typical of second language speakers. So it has like subject-verb agreement errors, for instance. It does code switching, even though it's trained on the languages independently, but it will code switch. So for those of you who don't know, code switching is when you start a sentence in one language and then you can insert certain phenomena or phrases from another language into that same utterance. And it also accounts for cross-linguistic priming. So Co and colleagues argued that if the model itself is a good model of cross-linguistic priming, and therefore priming is result of error-based learning, then it should be able to simulate a lot of the cross-linguistic priming effects in the literature. So they simulated the Bernoulli effects with the Dutch passive and found the exact same results, where constituent word order overlap results in greater amount of priming, but constituent word order overlap is not a precondition for priming. So they still find it when there is this difference in word order between the Dutch passive and the English passive. So it predicts priming in the absence of constituent word order overlap. Note, however, right, that this is really nice, but when you're still using this like related languages, there's still some similarity here, and that's because you're starting off with a patient mapping to a subject, right? So there's still too much similarity here for my liking, I think. So what's the state of play? So the locus of priming is unclear. It could be in what we might think of as the meaning system in the Chang model. It could be, it could start in the meaning system, and it could be because people are putting patients before agents, and that could be nice. Or it could be the mappings between the thematic role and the grammatic role, in addition to being the full overlap condition where there's constituent word overlap as well. So as I've sort of alluded to several times here, I think we do have an over-reliance on Indo-European languages here. So we're not being able to tease all these things apart because these mappings are not always separate. So this brings me to Austronesian languages. So Austronesian languages is the second biggest language family in the world, but there's hardly any research that's done on it in the psycholinguistic literature. It's Austronesian, the ancestor of the Austronesian languages who came from Taiwan and then sort of radiated out were great seafarers, as we can see. So they've populated Madagascar, as far as Madagascar in the west, depending on where you're asked, but it's in the west from here, to Easter Island in the east, right? And so this is something like 1,200 different languages, and two languages that I'm going to speak about today is quite large Austronesian languages, actually. The first is Tagalog, which is spoken in the Philippines, and the second is Indonesian, or what we might call Standard Indonesian, and we were working in Jakarta for this particular experiment. So I'm going to first talk about Tagalog. So Tagalog is a really pretty cool language, hopefully, if you'll agree with me. It's a lingua franca of the Philippines, so it's the sort of native, I suppose you would say, to the red part of this particular map. But as a lingua franca, it's often the second language of most people in the Philippines because they'll be educated in it and things like that. It has this really cool Philippine-style symmetrical voice system, which I'll explain in a moment, so don't worry too much about what that means. But unlike sort of the English passive, where you can make arguments to say the passive sentence is more complex than an active sentence, what it has is different structures that are not more or less complex than each other, right? They just, they're sort of balanced, I suppose, and there's separate structures as well, whereas many people have made arguments to say the active and the passives derive from the active. It's verb initial, and it has post-verbal arguments, which are relatively free, which I'll show you about in a moment. But that's important because in our Tagalog experiments, there's absolutely no constituent word order overlap between between English, which is going to be our second language that we look at in our bilinguals. So a quick tour of Tagalog voice marking system. So basically, I'm going to tell you about two types of voice marking in Tagalog, one called the agent voice and one called the patient voice. So what happens in Tagalog is you have a verb and you have to mark it with an infix. So this infix here is the agent voice infix, which is and then what that infix does is tells you something about the thematic role of the subject in the sentence, so which is marked by the ung phrase. So what this sentence here means is that the bear is kicking a frog. So ung also is bear, so that means because it's marked with the agent voice, it means the subject of the sentence is going to be an agent, right? The cool thing about Tagalog is that you can change that little infix and it reverses the interpretation of the sentence. So this is the patient voice. So if you change the infix, you have the same material, then suddenly the bear is the patient, right? So for our purposes, what it does is it enables us to tease apart what's a subject and what's an agent, right? We can't do that in languages like Dutch and German and English. Right? So this means, as I'll show you later, what we can do is try and get at that top level. We can try and just prime patients to see if you have more patient first Tagalog sentences, does that lead to a passive sentence in English, in Tagalog English bilinguals? Another feature of Tagalog is that, like I said, the post-verbal nouns are just completely scrambled. That's completely fine, and it means the same thing. So this sentence here, even though it has different word order after the verb, it means the exact same thing. Okay, so this leads us to experiment 1. So what we did is we priming Tagalog English bilinguals to determine the influence of solely thematic role order on cross-linguistic priming. So what we've done here is we have primes like this, where there's only overlap with English in the thematic role order of the passive. So we're using the agent voice, and in the agent voice, the agent is the subject, but we can scramble the word order. So we're just putting the patient at the bit before the agent, and then we're seeing if we get an increase in the amount of passives when people are asked to produce an English sentence after a prime like this. Any questions at the moment? I'm not bamboozling you, I hope, with... Oh, okay, could I? So there's only overlap in thematic role order. So how did we do this experiment? We did unsupervised web-based priming experiments. I'm thankful to Andy for leading the way in leading online experimentation, I suppose, which you must have been doing for many years now, right? So this was a great way to be able to collect data remotely and in different languages. So we used the Gorilla platform. Our speakers, L1 speakers of Tagalog, but incredibly proficient speakers of English, but the English is the L2. The first 2 experiments are going to be in Tagalog, but the third experiment is going to talk about Indonesian. We wanted to test whether or not these participants had proficient English, because of course we need them to have proficient English for them to be bilingual enough to be able to be primed. And so we tested them on a task, a very quick task, but a very reliable task called the Lex Tail task, which, and we used a minimum of score of 70% in order to include the participant in our final analyses. Just some other basic things about the experiment. There are 32 experimental trials per participant. We primed from Tagalog to English, which is really our focus, but we wanted, after much discussion amongst our team, we wanted to also replicate priming effects within English to show that the participants are proficient enough to be primed in English as well. So this is just a check. Our analyses were Bayesian logistic mixed effects models, and here is how it worked. So, or the flow of the priming. So participants would get a prime sentence, and this would either be in Tagalog or in English. Then they would get a picture, and they would just have to, you always have to do a cover task for these things to make sure people don't really know what you're doing. You don't want them to start matching the primes, I guess, because we want it to be an implicit effect. And so they got the prime picture, and they had to judge whether or not the prime picture matched the prime sentence. And then they were given a verb in English, right? That's because we wanted them to use the same verb, basically. And then we gave them the picture that they had to describe. Right. So results for our first experiment. These are the results from English. So we get a priming effect in English. So these figures here show the estimated population means, but I've got the raw difference here as well. So we get like a big priming effect for English to English priming. So these participants were primed at a rate of almost 33%. We did have verb overlap between the prime and target, and this is an explanation for the result of the large priming effect. But importantly, did we get priming from Tagalog into English? Yes, but really weak, right? So it's sort of like an anecdotal effect here. So that's okay, because this was the first experiment. We were really surprised we actually got this effect, right? That we got something coming out, but we kind of are skeptical as to whether it's sort of real, right? So I think also if we didn't have the same event representation or what we might call conceptual overlap between the prime and target across the two languages, where it's the same action, we probably wouldn't have got any effect. Okay, so this leads me to experiment 2. So all we have to do in Tagalog is change the voice to start getting more overlap, to get the mapping from patient to subject and agent to object. So in this experiment, we use the patient voice in our primes, and suddenly we're now testing whether or not we do need the mapping from patient to subject in the absence of constituent word order overlap to observe a priming effect. So the only overlap with the English passive is the mapping from the grammatical to the thematic role, right? There's no constituent word order overlap because Tagalog is verb initial. Okay, here's the English to English results. We pretty much replicate the effect that we found before. These are different participants, so that's always nice to see, right? Then in the Tagalog to English, what we find is a bigger priming effect, right? Yeah, so we have almost a 7% priming effect, which is not bad for actual priming studies and cross-linguistic priming studies, and a much better evidence in favour of the alternative hypothesis here. So there's a difference between experiment 1 and experiment 2, which suggests that actually the priming doesn't occur in the meaning system. It's really actually occurring in the combination of the meaning and the grammatical system, if we think of the Chang model as a way to think about our results. So interim discussion with Tagalog, at least, there's negligible priming when there's only thematic role overlap, but greater priming when there are mappings between the grammatical and the thematic role. And in fact, we did a pooled analysis and we get the 3-way interaction that we might expect here. So that's nice. The cross-linguistic priming is small in comparison to within language priming. That's not surprising at all. It's particularly because in the English example, we have this lexical boost effect from the verb overlap. It's not due to English proficiency at all because we have very highly proficient English speakers here. But we don't know at the moment how much constituent word order overlap is going to add to this. So this leads us now to standard Indonesian. I'm not sure if many of you know about the sort of social linguistic profile of Indonesia, but standard Indonesian or Bahasa Indonesia is a lingua franca of Indonesian. Indonesia itself is a highly linguistically diverse society, so many people grow up speaking a different Austronesian languages, and they might speak standard Indonesian in, say, in educational contexts and things like that, and university. So Bahasa Indonesian is sort of part of the Malay macro language. It's like Tagalog from the same family, but it is very different in terms of its voice system. In fact, the really lovely part about it is there's almost complete overlap with English in terms of the active and the passive, which is really great for our purposes. So we recruited solely from Jakarta because we wanted to minimize the kind of social linguistic variability that we might find between speakers of different regions. And this is also because many people speak Bahasa at home in Jakarta as well, so we're more likely to get a more homogeneous sample, I suppose. A few facts about standard Indonesian. It has rigid subject word or verb object word order for transitive sentences, just like English. It has a voice alternation. It has an active and people call it a passive voice, but like Tagalog, they're argued to be individual constructions, unlike English where the argument is that they're related. I'll show you some examples at the moment, and the important thing to point out here, though, is that we have really lovely overlap at a level of constituent word order and mappings from grammatical roles to thematic roles as well. So we should expect greater priming, right, for Indonesian than for Tagalog. So here's an example of an active in Indonesian. I won't pronounce it because I don't want to offend any Indonesian speakers. But here we have basically, you can say, bear kicks frog, right? Just like English, SVO. And then this affix here just says this is an active sentence, so therefore the bear is the subject, right? In the passive, we change we have a different affix here, a different suffix, and then this says that the bear is actually the patient, right? It's still the subject, but it's actually the patient. Quite nicely, Indonesian allows us to sort of include a by phrase as well, which is marked by this bold line. So it's really a lot like English. So, so basically here, that means the form of overlap is at all of these levels here, right? So this is why, because there's all this overlap, we should expect a greater priming effect. Right. So what did we find? Okay. In English to English, actually a huge effect, right? Double what we found with Tagalog, and they were equivalent on their Lextal scores as well. I think there might be some carryover here that's going on because the participants had interleaved trials between English and English and Indonesian and English, which I'll come back to, and I think means something. But what's the priming effect in Indonesian? Quite big, right? It's 5 times larger than it is in the in experiment 2, which is which was a nice effect. We didn't expect it to be this big, but it really was a lot higher. And when we did a pooled analysis again, it's higher than the Tagalog experiments. So what we have is increased priming effects depending on the degree of overlap between the languages. To sum up, when we just have thematic role overlap, the priming is negligible. Right. So once again, when we're just in the meaning system of this Chang model, priming is across languages is pretty small to be insignificant. And in fact, even within languages, when you can sort of be clever enough to do simply thematic role priming, it's a pretty weak effect. However, why is this the case? Well, like I said, the primes are within the meaning system only at the message level. And if you think about the way the message level proceeds in the Chang model, it's temporary. These are just temporary ephemeral mappings. It's only once we get into the nuts and bolts of the grammatical system where we start to get priming. So when we have mappings between thematic roles and grammatical roles, we've got greater priming, and we think this is because the functional mappings between thematic and grammatic roles constitute a clear locus of priming, and this is independent of constituent structure. This is consistent with the bilingual dual path model of Coe and colleagues, but then again, once we have all of these forms of overlap, this is when we're getting the greatest amounts of priming, and we think this might mean something different in these cases, which I'll come to now. So that priming is different with different forms of overlap suggests to us a few things, although I'm not completely convinced of my own reasoning here, so maybe will be a great place to stop off and have a discussion as well. But the first thing is that it suggests the representational distinctiveness of thematic roles, grammatic roles, and constituent structure. Now, I know there are a few linguists in the room who would just basically say, well, we knew that anyway just by analysing language. But I think a nice thing about the priming methodology is that it can get at these things in a different way and experimentally, and therefore tell us something about the architecture of the language faculty itself. And in fact, this is arguments. These are not my arguments, but arguments made by people like Holly Brannigan. And this is embodied in the dual path architecture and the classic verbal theories of sentence production. So in the dual path architecture and classic theories of sentence production, you start out with a message and then you start to map that message onto sort of functional roles, which is mappings from thematic roles to grammatical roles, and then you start assembling this information into a constituent structure. And what we're finding here is sort of like degrees of priming, some more significant than others at those different levels. So a big kind of debate that's currently gone on here in this literature is what's shared, what representations are so tightly integrated you might argue that they're shared, or maybe the others are just simply linked. At the beginning of the identification of the effect, many people did argue, oh, this means that they're shared constituent structure and that's it, there's just shared mental representations. But I think that as we test more and more different languages, like Tagalog, then the argument for complete representational overlap is probably too strong an argument, and that there's probably degrees of there's probably degrees of linkage versus representational overlap. And I think we might have those two examples in our data. So the thematic grammatical role priming, we think, is likely driven by separate structural representations, right? But when you're getting a Tagalog prime, where you're mapping a subject to a patient, this, if it creates an error signal, and in this case, it's unusual in this particular structure to have this configuration, then what is probably happening here is an updating of a general updating to say, okay, a subject is a patient, and this may therefore link to the English passive, but there's no complete representational overlap here. I think we really couldn't say that would happen. So the prominence of the patient subject position is what's increasing the likelihood of producing the English passive here. But beyond that, there's no real representational overlap of note, I would say. However, when you have the full overlap with constituent structure, like in Indonesian, this is where the representations may be more likely to be shared, right? Because you've got this full overlap. And in fact, if you're a second language speaker, it could be the case that your second language representations are parasitic upon your first language representations. This would account for the higher priming effect that we find in Indonesian. It also might account for the sort of backwards increase in priming in the English example as well, in the experiment 3. But this is one of those, it's a serendipitous kind of thing. I've been working on sort of transfer for quite some time. And when I was thinking about this, I realized that some old data of mine supports this argument, which is always nice, I suppose. But what we found in a study that we published quite some time ago is that there's sort of instances of spontaneous transfer that occur when you have this constituent word order overlap. And so forgive me, I'm introducing 2 more languages to this talk, so I'm very sorry. But years ago with my first PhD student ever, actually, Sanyo Nijke, we did a study where we were interested in just general syntactic transfer from one language to another, and we were looking at German and Italian. Our 2 speakers of German and Italian who had English as their first language. And we exploited this ambiguity that occurs in both of these languages. So in German here ist die Großmutter, die man lernen, erschreckt, right? And this in English, if you use this, if you follow the constituent word order, is an object relative clause. So it would translate in English to, here is the grandmother that the painter scares, right? But in German, it doesn't mean just this, right? It also can mean either of these interpretations. So it can actually mean, here is the painter that scares the grandmother, right? And this is because it exploits an unusual thing about German, where if you have feminine and neuter nouns, there's complete ambiguity between what's a subject and what's an object, or what's an agent, what's nominative and accusative case, right? And so German speakers don't interpret this according to, native German speakers don't interpret this according to the English way, the object relative clause. They interpret it as a subject relative clause. So they interpret, here as the grandmother, that is actually really quite difficult to think about. I'll put it this way. The English speakers use their English mappings to interpret it in German. That's the best way I can explain it. Now in Italian, there is a similar thing, right? But it follows a different constituent word order. So when you have ecco la nonna che spaventa la Patrice, this is here is the grandmother that scares the painter. Okay, that's the English interpretation. It's actually also ambiguous because Italian allows post-verbal subjects, but second language speakers of Italian who have English as their first language follow, as do first language speakers of Italian, by the way, follow the constituent word order, right? So basically you have this case where there's ambiguities, and the English speakers learning these languages just use their English strategies most of the time, such that there's a difference between them. So that's where, I guess, to wrap that up, to say that we think that in the case of the full overlap, that includes constituent word order overlap, there is a greater likelihood that there'll be representational integration between the two languages. This might be the only case where it happens, which might not be that common actually in bilingual speakers. Anyway, to wrap this up, what hopefully you take away from this, just generally, is that structural priming occurs between typologically unrelated languages. There had been some people who'd shown this before between, say, English and Korean, English and Mandarin. We were very surprised we found it between English and Tagalog, simply because the constituent word order is so different and languages are so different. It's smaller in language in magnitude than within language priming, but that's pretty fair to say that that would be expected, and varies with the degree of overlap between the languages. So this probably leads to, in bilingual speakers, partially integrated and linked language network, where multilinguals don't possess compartmentalized systems, but they have sort of integrated systems at sort of interesting parts of where the languages meet and where sort of joints and seams can be combined. And part of the interesting thing is, I guess, finding that. The effect isn't an experimental artifact. So I've done some work with my colleague Catherine Travis where we've looked at English and Spanish speakers in the US who speak New Mexican Spanish, which is a variety of Spanish, and we find that we get similar types of effects. In this case, we're looking at whether or not they produce a subject in Spanish or not. And shared syntactic knowledge might be limited to the cases of high overlap, which I've said before, which is dependent on constituent structure. Okay, to finish off, thank you very much. I have to thank people who have funded and who have supported this research, the Max Planck Gesellschaft and the ARC Centre of Excellence for the Dynamics of Language, which was supported by the ARC. So thank you very much, and I'm happy to take questions.
Time for maybe 2 questions. Meredith?
Yeah. Thanks.
Hi.
Lovely talk.
Thank
Lovely
you.
to see. I'm curious, I suppose, about the extent to which there's a lot of demand characteristics in some. I know it's a priming study, and you talk about trying to make it implicit by interpolating tasks. I wonder about other ways of perhaps asking participants to respond that might give a more a sense of a more automatic response, something that convinces me that there's something inherent to the system rather than the context of the experiment, the demands and the instructions that drives me trying to mirror what I've just heard. And I mean, this is lovely, elegant. Like I was very convinced by all the disentangling and beautifully elegant. But that sort of sits with me, and I wonder if there's any studies at all, you know, where there's more of a response time taken to make a decision between, and I'm not sure about all the confounds here about the time it takes you to process 2 different instances and how quickly you might endorse one versus another or something. But yeah, I was just trying to think of ways that I might be more convinced that it's not being driven by just sort of, not just a demand, but I think something about being in an experimental context where you know your 2 languages are, you know, if I'm bilingual, I might well have 2 separate lexica that don't usually talk to each other because I'm so proficient in L2. We're not back translating anymore or anything like that. But when I'm in a context like this, I might start to bring those pathways into play or something.
Yeah, I mean, I completely see what you're saying, because I think whenever you're trying to strip away the all of the confounding factors that occur in the wild in experiments, you are sort of putting people in a lane and pushing them towards the response, right? And so the question is, how aware are they, and how much is their behaviour a reflection of what happens in the world? And so I think probably the fact that it occurs across different contexts is probably indicates that the effects are there, and that there's probably not complete separation between the languages, but it could be the case that in the experiments that, like the ones we do, we get more effects, and that's always the problem. You're getting some false positive in the case of what might not occur in the wild, just coming out because of some strategic behaviour on the behalf of participants. So I guess if you take converging evidence. So you do find it in conversation. We have found it in bilingual corpora. In the same way, so in our New Mexican Spanish English study, we find greater within language priming and weaker between language priming. That was with provision of grammatical subjects. It's very different, but that, to my knowledge, I don't think anyone else has really done it in corpora. And using different experimental methods, say via comprehension, you'd also find similar effects. The question is what's, I guess, partitioning what's the implicit part and what's the explicit part. And yeah, I
mean, I like the developmental idea about, that kids do this kind of as part of learning. It suggests that there's something inherent in the way that they might just mirror something that's it's interesting that the models produce it as part of their learning, although who knows for what reasons the model might be doing that. But anyway,
One fast one for you now.
Really fast question. I know that in lexical priming, the priming effect isn't really robust to the individual. You get it in the group level, but not every individual in the study shows it. So I was wondering if you looked at that in this kind of structural priming context.
Yes, not in adults, but in children, we've looked at sort of individual variability, and it is true that you will get individual variability. Actually, I should introduce Shanti Kumraga here, who's done a lot of this work, and I guess you've been closer to the data. Yeah, I think, well, with any of you do these types of stuff, you might get people who are out of 16 trials, you might get 12 passives versus ones that get very few. But my feeling is you don't get an overwhelming number who give you nothing, right? And I feel like what it is the development of the effect can be different, right? So sometimes you will find it very early in some participants and only very late in other participants as well. And this stands to reason, given that there are tangible individual differences in people's language and all the sort of other sort of cognitive variables. I guess in my experience, the challenge though is how to quantify that variability. But yeah, you do, just if you look at the data structure, you will get a range of responses, that's for sure. And what predicts that range of responses is a little bit kind of currently a little bit unclear. Yeah, sorry.
Could you see that in the lexical scores in terms of Frank's question about
We didn't find it actually. Yeah, so Safina did the used the Indonesian as for her MSc, and she didn't find that the Lex tail scores were related to the size of priming. And this has been something that Rob Hartzelker and colleagues have argued would happen, that with greater proficiency, you should get differences in priming, but we didn't find it.
It's quite a narrow range.
Sorry, I'm gonna have to say, let's
Sure.
continue this great discussion at lunch, but let's all say thank you.